moving on to our deep dive?
Are you ready?
Let's do this. We should just speak like a whole trailer for each deep dive that we do. In a world
where
the
homelessness is worse than ever and people die.
So our deep dive this week is on a policy called Housing First, which I'm going to just start with defining.
Yeah.
The idea, so after homelessness kind of took its current day form in the 80s, generally there was a policy that focused on treatment first.
Yes.
It was, we're going to treat the vast majority of homeless people who have some kind of underlying condition, usually psychological, whether that's addiction or a different mental health disorder. We're going to provide them with treatment, and then only based on how they progress through that treatment, whether they get better, will we determine whether we will give them housing.
And in many ways, it was holding these people who were struggling to the highest possible standard.
Totally.
I mean, we're talking about no alcohol at all. Everyone drinks every once in a while, man. I mean, I don't know what to tell you. It's like holding to this, or also like people had to stay on their psychiatric care. Yeah. And there are so many people who don't go to therapy that should.
Yes. No, totally.
It's like they were demanding these people to become the perfect citizen before they got long-term housing assistance.
Yes. And I think the question is whether, like, the real value question at the heart here is, does anyone deserve to be homeless?
Right.
Right? Does any amount of doing drugs or drinking or poverty mean that someone should be homeless? And I have a very fundamental, strong stance here that answer is no.
Yeah.
Everyone deserves a home. It is a human right. I think anyone who says otherwise has not found it in themselves yet to empathize with the position of not having a home, of not knowing whether someone's going to tell you that you have to go somewhere else and sleep, of knowing whether your few possessions are going to be stolen or you'll be attacked while you are trying to sleep somewhere else.
Or sexually abused, which is massive in the homeless community.
Exactly. So I think I'll start with the foundation there. And given that, Housing First takes a different route, right? Housing First says we want to give these people permanent, stable housing regardless of their sobriety and what they do in mental health counseling or anything else. This Housing First kind of started to gain traction in the late 90s, early 2000s. There was an organization, I think it's called Housing Pathways, something Pathways. I have it on one of my links here. But they started this. It was a nonprofit organization. And instantly they found fantastic results for specifically chronically homeless people. So their Housing First is good for any of the homeless, but chronically homeless people who are homeless for long stretches of time, versus transient homeless people, which sometimes have like a one-time shelter stay, or episodic homeless people, which means they have repeated or brief stays at shelters. They are the ones who not only need housing the most of the time, but also who are the biggest drain on resources to support those in need if they don't have housing. And I'll get into that later. But there was a meta-analysis of 4 randomized control studies. I want to talk about this to talk about how Housing First is so much better, so much more effective at solving homelessness, at keeping people housed than the treatment first model. This meta-analysis found that housing the homeless people, the patients or the subjects who were placed in the Housing First part of the trial, experienced a housing retention rate of 80%, which means 80% of the days that they ran this study, or for the days they ran this study, the people in this portion, in the Housing First portion, were stably housed for 80% of those days. In the treatment as usual group, those people were housed for only 30% of the days.
Wow.
That is a massive, massive difference. And basically every study that has looked at housing first versus treatment first finds these effects, finds that people are, the argument used to be that people are not housing ready, that you have to get them housing ready with treatment to be able to keep them stably housed. That's not the case, and that never was the case. I will say, very important thing to note here, housing first, this randomized control studies have shown housing first does not really have any significant difference in effect from treatment first models for other problems. It doesn't help more than treatment first with sobriety or psychological issues. So I don't want to say this is a catch-all. When you give people housing, you still need to give them the other assistance that they need. But I do buy into the argument that once people are housed, they can actually focus on some of these other issues better, rather than just, where do I sleep tonight? What am I going to get to eat?
Yes. And I think it's very effective, I believe, at preventing mental health struggles. Because so many things happen to you while you're homeless, whether it be PTSD, whether it be suicide attempts for being homeless, whether it be being in fight or flight mode every hour of every day.
Yeah.
Like that's what causes schizophrenia. That's a direct cause of schizophrenia. And so it's a preventative measure as well to those people who were chronically homeless, to try to catch them before they develop mental illnesses from being homeless.
Totally. I think, we'll stick with that. I want to talk about two examples of where housing first has been implemented. So one was in Utah, where in 2005, Utah implemented housing first policy, and their plan was a 10-year plan to end homelessness in the state. So by 2015, they wanted to completely wipe it out, and they were going to do it with housing first.
Good job, Utah.
In effect, it reduced chronic homelessness by 71% over that period. Not 100, but still
very impressive.
Huge strides, right?
Massive.
That is big.
Impressive.
The important thing here, and I mentioned about the resources earlier, what they found in addition to combating homelessness is it was so much less expensive to house the homeless than it was to treat them with the normal methods, which the normal methods are often giving really expensive tents to people in homeless encampments. It's treating them at the emergency room constantly because they have these severe health conditions that need treatment all the time. It's police that's needed to move them around because they're never allowed to stay where they want to stay.
Yeah.
According to the director of the Utah program, the average chronically homeless person costs Salt Lake City more than $20,000 a year. It costs only $8,000 to put someone into permanent housing.
Doesn't that makes me so unbelievably mad? It does. It makes me really mad.
It's crazy.
Because it makes it so obvious that homelessness is a choice we're making.
Yeah.
You know? It's like we talk about how poverty is a lot of the times a choice.
Yeah.
How we had the expanded child tax credit and how we reduced poverty by 30-something%. And then we, let it expire and poverty shot right back up. It's a choice we're making, guys.
Yes.
And we're all just sitting on our asses choosing to have our fellow humans sleep on the street.
Yep.
And it makes me sick.
It's terrible. And it to me, it speaks to a lack of guts for policymakers to pay up front so that you can solve these problems and reap the benefits as time goes on, right? I cannot think of a better reason to take on debt than a program like this.
Can't think of a better reason.
Right? It's perfect.
Because it has a return. It has a return, right?
Yeah.
It has a return because you're spending less money on all the other things.
Totally,
Yes.
totally. So the one other thing I want to say, Utah looked at this program as a decade-long program, which means it ended in 2015.
Oh.
And since then, the homeless population has continued to increase, which means Utah has regressed. And so why did this happen? It's because the resources were allocated for that point in time. But the truth is, this is an issue that needs continuous attention, right? I looked vaguely into like causes of homelessness, and cost of rent is like the biggest correlation with homelessness rates in any given place, right? That just means people start to live in their cars and then to live on the street eventually when they can't pay the rent because it's gotten too high. That means that because you don't know how rents are going to increase, how the economy is going to fluctuate, you need to constantly have resources allocated to be able to grant people housing so that they don't go homeless.
Yes.
The other example I wanted to talk about was California, because there's a difference, or there's a nuance here that I think is important to address. So Gavin Newsom, who's now the governor, was the mayor of San Francisco in 2004, and he introduced a similar program to Utah's. He aimed to build 3,000 permanent housing units for the homeless for the next decade. If you know anything about the state of homelessness in the U.S. now, you know that San Francisco is the hub for homelessness, and California in general, of course. So Newsom actually hit his target of the 3,000 permanent housing units, but it didn't account for an influx of new homeless people, which California had in droves throughout this period. So because of that, the plan towards permanent housing, there were still limited resources, right? So some of those resources came out of making temporary shelters for people. Now, when we talk about housing first, we're kind of saying we want to put people in permanent housing instead of temporary shelters. But when you have people going homeless, like in the immediate term, you still need those temporary shelters to take care of people. And in the immediate term, it allowed unsheltered homelessness to rise. So,
wait, unsheltered homelessness to decline, you mean?
No, because they didn't have the temporary shelters.
Oh, unsheltered homelessness rose because they didn't have the temporary shelters.
Exactly.
Got it.
Exactly. And the 3,000 units weren't enough.
Got it.
Then we take a look at Los Angeles, which also tried to pursue a housing first program. Now, their problem was that they couldn't hit the target number of new permanent units because of California's zoning and permitting laws.
Classic.
Yes, which are generally the cause of our housing shortage. And the Stanford Institute for Economic and Policy Research said in places with a housing shortage like coastal California, there's a long wait before permanent housing becomes available, which defies the original vision of Housing First to immediately provide an apartment. The high capital costs to develop permanent supportive housing in some localities can prohibit Housing First as a viable option. So that seems to be saying zoning and permitting have to be addressed first. They are a bottleneck to being able to make Housing First a policy that works.
Honestly, that is like zoning reform is the biggest problem in the country, period. I mean, it stops us from fighting climate change. It stops us from building houses for the homeless.
Yes.
It stops us from building housing, period.
Yeah, I would legitimately make a plea, and it's like a little bit of work to be a member of your local government, but anyone who's listening to this, that local government is where these battles are won. Sometimes in California, and in Massachusetts, we just had a law passed. There are state laws that get passed that kind of they preempt local governments as far as what they're allowed to zone for. But generally, these are local battles that are happening across the country to allow for denser housing for more people. And if you are interested in this at all, if you, like us, think that this is an issue that's kind of causing so many other issues, and you want to get involved in your local government, you would be a huge help.
And you should email us.
Totally.
And you should email us.
Yes.
Our email is everythingsucks.let'sfixit@gmail.com.
Yeah.
That's it. Email us. I ran for local office. I am 24 years old, and I am in local government, and I just voted to upzone a portion of our town so that we can build more housing.
Yeah.
If you have that same desire, you should contact and email us. We'll talk with you.
We'll help.
We'll help.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, good. That's awesome, dude.
Yeah.
I want to talk about how the Biden administration is handling our homelessness problem. So in 2021, the Housing and Urban Development team, it launched the program House America. And they were planning on trying to cut the homeless population in half by January 2025. That was their goal. Well, none of that happened.
No.
We just saw an 11.5% increase. What did we see? A 12% increase in homelessness in 2023. So we didn't see that, unfortunately. But they are saying a lot of the right things. They are looking at, and they're saying a lot of the right things. They want to change regulatory flexibility for federal housing programs, which this is good. This is kind of what we're talking about when we talk about treatment second. Identify access to identification, medical, and benefit documentation needed to determine eligibility. That's at least in the right track because it's getting it more transparent on getting you into the house.
Yes,
Right?
definitely.
Strengthening collaboration between federal, state, and local agencies. This is super important. For too long, the federal government has really been outside of the fight of public and affordable housing. They haven't really been as active as they should be. And the Biden administration is at least saying that they want to be an ally in that fight.
Yeah.
They talk also about a housing supply action plan. And this is really good stuff. This I like. They want to reward jurisdictions that do zoning reform and change their land use policies.
I think they have already implemented that.
Yes, they've implemented this one.
Yeah.
So the federal government gives local governments money when they change their zoning laws so that more housing can get built.
Yeah.
Which is really, really good. And then they want to ensure that more government-owned supply of homes and other housing units never get bought up by private investors, which is also a really good step.
Yes.
That needs to go further. We need to make sure that houses can't be bought, single-family houses can't be bought by large investors. Yeah. That needs to stop. Investment funds and banks, whatever, I'm not going to say that too much, but investment funds definitely need to be barred from purchasing single-family housing.
Yeah.
That's unacceptable. So... yeah, from my view, though, I just don't think that Joe Biden and the Democrats really did enough when they had control of the House and Senate. I don't think they did enough to do homelessness.
I agree.
They didn't tackle it.
It just needs it needs a lot of money.
It needs a lot of money. And you know what's sad? Homeless people do not have any political power.
No.
And because they have no political power, there's no political interest to fight for them. Yeah. Because the truth is that they can't really vote. How do you vote without an address? How hard is it to vote without an address? I'll tell you, it's very hard to vote without an address.
Yeah.
There is no political benefit in fighting the homeless because they're not a constituency that's going to vote either way.
I agree. But on the other hand, we do know that rents are closely correlated with homelessness.
That's true.
And I think like high rents do cause homelessness a lot of the time.
Yeah, if you're going to tackle high rents and you're going to do zoning reform, I definitely think that that's a good way to go about it.
That's going to attack homelessness, and there is a massive constituency that does care about those things enormously.
Yeah, and I think maybe we could even look at that 12% increase in homelessness and have the analysis that, look, we just went through a big inflationary spiral where the cost of rent went up like 10% over the year.
Yeah.
Maybe it was always natural that that was going to lead to a spike in homelessness, right? Maybe that's not a failure of the policy. Maybe that's indicative of the macroeconomic trend, but the fact that those 12% of people are still homeless and then weren't immediately assisted with getting back on their feet is the problem.
Well, I think it's the combination of super high rents and the ending of subsidies from the American Rescue Plan.
That's definitely right. We saw massive reductions in homelessness from the American Rescue Plan. Again, we've talked about this too. We did a whole deep dive on this. The American Rescue Plan basically built out a new American social safety net.
Yes.
It did a lot of rental assistance. It did a lot of housing assistance. It did the child tax credit, which was basically a child allowance. It expanded Obamacare subsidies for health insurance. It did a lot.
Yeah.
It did a lot. And we just kind of let it all go away. Subsidies for childcare too, which are going away.
Yeah.
And so there's going to be a reaction, and our economy is going to have to remold to this post-American Rescue Plan money world.
Totally.
Which is so sad because, again, it's all choices, man.
Yeah, it is all choices. And I think we've talked about this a little bit off camera, and I think we'll hopefully find a way to kind of pigeonhole it into another deep dive at some point. But what we really need to combat not only homelessness, but also to lower rents and housing prices for everyone is basically a public option for housing, and one that is constantly building up stock, that is constantly expanding, so that these prices can't just run away like crazy. Because when you have a basic need where the supply is far outstripped by demand, massively inflated prices are the only outcome that you can get. And the only way to hold those down is an expanding government supply.
that exists outside of the market and charges based off cost and lower
income.
rents and
Yes.
income. Yes.
Charges based off income, because that way you don't have to worry about a homeless, unemployed person. But we'll probably get into how that will look at a later date.
So yeah. All right, guys, homelessness sucks. If you have any inclination to fight for it or a better future or to be involved in your local government, email us. Everything sucks. Let's fix it at gmail.com. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.